The trained cadaver dog freezes mid-step, its entire body suddenly rigid with purpose. The handler's grip tightens on the leash as he watches the animal's behavior shift in an instant, tail stiffening like a rod, nose working frantically through the stale air of the vacation apartment. Then it comes, a sharp, unmistakable bark that cuts through the silence of apartment 5A at the Ocean Club Resort in Praia de Luz. The sound every handler both expects and dreads. The dog has detected the scent of human death. Days later, another specialist dog alerts again, this time in the trunk of a rental car, a vehicle the family didn't even rent until 24 days after their daughter vanished into the Portuguese night. These weren't just any dogs. They were elite British police canines with impeccable records, having successfully identified human remains in over 200 cases across Europe. Animals trained to distinguish between the living and the dead with a precision that rivals laboratory equipment. Yet somehow, these crucial alerts, these biological confirmations of death, became nothing more than a footnote in one of the most publicized missing person cases in modern history. The question isn't whether the dogs were right. The question is why no one wanted to believe them. On the evening of May 3, 2007, 3-year-old Madeleine McCann disappeared from her family's vacation apartment in the quiet Portuguese coastal town of Praia de Luz. The sun had already set over the Atlantic, casting long shadows across the whitewashed buildings of the Ocean Club Resort. Inside apartment 5, 3 children slept in their beds. Outside, their parents sat at a tapas restaurant with friends, wine glasses catching the warm glow of outdoor lighting, laughter drifting across the pool area. It was supposed to be the final night of a perfect family vacation. Instead, it became the beginning of a mystery that would consume headlines, destroy reputations, and expose the terrifying power of narrative over truth. Kate and Jerry McCann were both British doctors, successful, articulate, upper-middle-class professionals who had worked hard to afford this week-long getaway with 7 friends. The group, later dubbed the Tapas 7 by a media hungry for catchy labels, had established what they considered a reasonable routine during their stay. Days spent by the pool or beach, children playing in the Portuguese sunshine. Evenings meant dinner at the resort's tapas restaurant while their children slept in their respective apartments, doors unlocked, parents taking turns checking on them every half hour or so. They compared it to dining in their backyard while the kids slept inside. A perfectly normal parenting decision, they insisted. Nothing reckless, nothing negligent. But on May 3rd, something went catastrophically wrong. According to the timeline the McCanns would later provide to authorities, everything that day had proceeded normally, unremarkably, the kind of day that blurs into all the others on vacation. They'd spent time at the pool, the children had eaten dinner, bath time, pajamas. By 7:30 that evening, all 3 McCann children were in bed. Madeleine wore her favorite short-sleeved pink pajamas, the ones with Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh printed on the fabric. Her stuffed toy, Cuddle Cat, was tucked beside her. The twins, just 2 years old, slept in travel cots nearby. By 8:30, Kate and Jerry had joined their friends at the tapas restaurant. The distance from their apartment to their table measured roughly 180 feet, close enough to see the building, too far to hear a child cry out. The checking system, as the group described it to police, involved the adults taking turns visiting their apartments throughout the evening, a rotation of responsibility. At 9:05, Jerry McCann reported checking on his children. He found all 3 sleeping soundly. He even mentioned adjusting Madeleine's blanket, taking a moment to look at his daughter, thinking how beautiful she was. It's a detail he would repeat in numerous interviews afterward, that specific moment of paternal tenderness, that last peaceful image of his daughter sleeping. At 9:15, another member of their group, a woman named Jane Tanner, claimed she saw something. While returning to the restaurant after checking on her own children, she spotted a man carrying a child in pajamas. The man was walking away from the McCann apartment, moving with purpose through the darkened streets. Tanner didn't think much of it at the time. Parents carrying sleeping children weren't unusual at a family resort. This sighting would become a cornerstone of what happened next, a crucial piece of evidence that seemed to confirm the worst fears of every parent watching the story unfold on their television screens. But that came later. First came the discovery. At approximately 10 o'clock, Kate McCann left the restaurant to check on the children. She walked the familiar path back to apartment 5, perhaps thinking about returning to her wine, to the conversation and laughter of friends on vacation. She opened the door, stepped inside, moved toward the children's bedroom, and found Madeleine's bed empty. According to Kate's account, the bedroom window was open, the shutters were raised. The kind of details that immediately suggest forced entry, an intruder, a predator who had slipped in while parents dined just 180 feet away. Kate ran back to the restaurant, her voice rising in panic, cutting through the pleasant evening atmosphere like a blade. "They've taken her," she cried, the words that would echo through news reports for years to come. "They've taken her." What followed was chaos. Resort staff and guests formed impromptu search parties, combing the grounds, checking bushes, calling Madeleine's name into the darkness. Flashlights swept across the beach. Strangers looked under beds and in closets. The Portuguese police arrived within 15 minutes, but crucial protocols for missing children cases weren't immediately implemented. No border alerts were issued until the following morning. The crime scene apartment 5A itself was not properly secured. Dozens of people entered and left, their footprints overlapping, their fingerprints contaminating surfaces, their presence potentially destroying evidence that could never be recovered. By morning, the case had exploded across British media like a bomb. The McCanns, with their photogenic family and articulate middle-class presentation, made compelling figures for public sympathy. Their first public appearance showed them walking hand in hand, Kate clutching Madeleine's stuffed cuddle cat against her chest. The image was perfect for front pages. Grief rendered visual, a mother's desperate connection to her missing child. The abduction theory took hold immediately, spreading through news coverage like wildfire through dry brush. Initial reports focused on a botched burglary or a pedophile ring operating in the area. The narrative was simple, horrifying, and played on the primal fears of parents everywhere. An innocent child, snatched from her bed while her parents dined nearby. A monster lurking in the Portuguese darkness. A family's vacation transformed into an unthinkable nightmare. Within days, the McCann campaign reached levels of sophistication unprecedented for a missing person case. They established a fund that would eventually exceed $2.5 million. Celebrity supporters emerged from everywhere. David Beckham made public appeals. J.K. Rowling contributed financially. Richard Branson offered resources. The couple was granted an audience with Pope Benedict himself, creating powerful imagery that reinforced their portrayal as grieving parents deserving of global support. British media outlets competed to show their concern, offering substantial rewards for information. The News of the World alone pledged $1.5 million. The case received more coverage than major natural disasters occurring simultaneously. More airtime than wars. This wasn't just a missing person case anymore. It had become a global phenomenon, a story that transcended normal news cycles. The McCanns hired multiple public relations specialists, including Clarence Mitchell, a former BBC news anchor who left his position at the UK government's media monitoring unit to become their full-time spokesman. Mitchell's media savvy ensured the abduction narrative remained dominant in coverage. Any alternative theories were quickly labeled as cruel speculation or heartless conspiracy theories. The message was clear and consistent. The McCanns were victims. Their daughter had been taken. Anyone suggesting otherwise was attacking grieving parents at their most vulnerable moment. By controlling the narrative through strategic media appearances and carefully worded statements, the McCanns transformed from private citizens into public figures who inspired both immense sympathy and unprecedented support. Their status as medical professionals lent them credibility. Their composed demeanor in interviews, occasionally breaking into controlled emotion, struck a chord with viewers worldwide. They became symbols of every parent's worst fear, and the public responded with an outpouring of support that bordered on religious fervor. This official narrative devoted parents facing an unimaginable tragedy became so entrenched in public consciousness that questioning it was often met with genuine hostility. The stage was set. The story was written. All that remained was finding the monster who had taken Madeleine McCann. But while this carefully managed narrative gathered momentum internationally, while celebrities pledged support and media outlets competed for exclusive interviews, a veteran Portuguese detective named Gonçalo Amaral was beginning to see cracks in the foundation. Amaral was the coordinator of the Polícia Judiciária in the Algarve region, a position he'd earned through 27 years of investigative experience. He wasn't the type of detective who appeared on television or gave press conferences. Stocky, with salt and pepper hair and a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow, he embodied the image of a detective who prioritized evidence over optics. His approach was old school in the best sense. Follow the evidence wherever it leads. Establish a timeline. Consider all possibilities, including those that might prove uncomfortable or controversial. Initially, Portuguese authorities treated Madeleine's disappearance exactly as the media portrayed it, an abduction. They launched extensive searches of the surrounding area. They interviewed resort staff and guests. They followed up on reported sightings. They did everything by the book for a missing child case. But as days passed without credible sightings, without ransom demands, without any of the typical developments in abduction cases, Amaral's team began noticing something troubling. The evidence they were gathering didn't quite fit the narrative everyone had accepted as truth. The first red flag emerged when forensic teams examined the bedroom window and shutters that Kate McCann claimed were open when she discovered Madeleine missing. The technical analysis revealed something unexpected. No fingerprints other than Kate's on the window. No signs of forced entry. The shutters, which the McCanns had initially suggested had been jemmied open by an intruder, showed no damage whatsoever. More significantly, the shutters could only be opened from inside the apartment. This physical evidence directly contradicted early statements from the McCanns' friends and family back in the UK, who had told British media that shutters had been jemmied, broken, or forced. These claims, which appeared to originate from the McCanns themselves in those first frantic phone calls home, were quietly abandoned as forensic evidence proved them impossible. But the British media never corrected the record. The image of forced shutters, of an intruder breaking in, had already taken root in public consciousness. The truth was less dramatic, less clear-cut, and therefore less newsworthy. Amaral noted this discrepancy, filed it away, kept investigating. Then came the development that would permanently alter the trajectory of the case, though the public wouldn't learn about it for months. In late July 2007, nearly 3 months after Madeleine's disappearance, British authorities sent specialized cadaver dogs to Portugal. This wasn't a routine procedure. These weren't ordinary police dogs trained to find missing persons or detect drugs. These were highly specialized animals trained for one specific purpose: to detect the scent of human decomposition, even weeks or months after death, even if extensive attempts had been made to clean the area. The first dog, named Eddie, was a cadaver dog trained to alert only to the odor of human remains. His record was impeccable. Over 200 cases across Europe, with successful identifications in everything from murder investigations to mass disaster sites. No false positives, no mistakes. The second dog, Keeler, was trained to detect human blood, even in microscopic amounts invisible to the naked eye, even after aggressive cleaning attempts. Their handler, Martin Grime, was one of the most respected experts in forensic canine detection in Europe. When his dogs alerted, investigators listened. What happened next stunned everyone involved in the investigation. Eddie, the cadaver dog, alerted to the scent of human decomposition in 5 specific locations: behind the sofa in the McCanns' living room, in the closet of their bedroom, on Kate McCann's clothing, on Madeleine's stuffed toy, Cuddlecat, the same toy Kate had been photographed clutching in those early public appearances, and perhaps most significantly, in the trunk of a rental car the McCanns had hired 24 days after Madeleine disappeared. Keeler, the blood detection dog, independently alerted to microscopic traces of blood in several of the same locations. Forensic teams immediately took samples from these areas for DNA analysis. The implications were staggering. If accurate, if these alerts meant what they appeared to mean, then a death had occurred in apartment 5A, and somehow, evidence of this death had been transferred to a car rented more than 3 weeks later. This directly contradicted everything the public had been told, everything the media had reported, everything the McCanns had claimed. But the dogs didn't lie. They didn't have agendas or media strategies. They simply detected what their training had taught them to find: the scent of death, the presence of blood. Simultaneously, Amaral's team was uncovering significant inconsistencies in witness statements. The timeline provided by the Tapas 7 showed troubling discrepancies when cross-referenced: who was where and when, who checked on children at what time. The details shifted depending on who was asked and when they were asked. Jane Tanner's sighting of a man carrying a child, that cornerstone of the abduction theory, contained details that changed over multiple interviews. The man's appearance, the direction he was walking, what the child was wearing. Each retelling added or altered elements in ways that seemed designed to strengthen the abduction narrative, rather than accurately report what she'd actually seen. Most notably, another witness had come forward. An Irish family named Smith reported seeing a man carrying a child, matching Madeleine's description at a different location and time than Tanner's sighting. This man was walking toward the beach rather than away from the resort. When shown photographs later, Martin Smith, the patriarch of the Irish family, stated he was 60 to 80% certain the man he saw was Gerry McCann himself. This bombshell revelation received minimal coverage in British media. It didn't fit the narrative. It raised uncomfortable questions, so it was buried beneath continued coverage of the search for the mysterious abductor. Perhaps most damning were the 48 questions that Kate McCann refused to answer when formally interviewed as a witness on September 7, 2007. These weren't invasive questions about her personal life or irrelevant details. They were basic inquiries about the night of the disappearance, about her reaction upon discovering Madeleine missing, about why she hadn't searched more actively for her daughter immediately after raising the alarm. 48 questions, 48 refusals to answer. On advice from her lawyer, Kate remained silent on matters that any parent of a missing child would typically be desperate to clarify. 3 days later, on September 10, 2007, Portuguese authorities took an unprecedented step. They formally named Kate and Gerry McCann as arguidos official suspects in their daughter's disappearance. The investigation had reached its turning point. The narrative was about to fracture, and the battle between evidence and emotion, between forensic findings and media manipulation, was only beginning. The cadaver dogs had spoken. The question was whether anyone would listen. Before we continue deeper into what Detective Amaral discovered, what evidence was suppressed, and why this case became a battleground between truth and narrative, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, because what you've heard so far is just the beginning of a story that will challenge everything you think you know about this case. The evidence gets more disturbing, the contradictions more glaring, and the lengths taken to protect the official narrative more shocking. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below. This case played out completely differently depending on which country you were in, which media you consumed, which narrative you were fed. Our community spans the globe, and your perspective matters as we unravel what really happened in Praia da Luz. Because here's the question you need to ask yourself as we move forward. If the evidence pointed away from abduction, if the forensic findings suggested something else entirely, if a veteran detective with 27 years of experience reached a different conclusion than what the media told you, would you have the courage to consider it? Or would you dismiss it because it's easier to believe in monsters than to question the narrative you've been sold? The answer to that question determines whether we're seeking truth or simply confirming what we want to believe. And in the case of Madeleine McCann, that distinction might be the difference between justice and a carefully constructed lie that's lasted nearly 2 decades. The truth has a scent. It lingers in places we'd rather not look, clings to objects we'd rather not examine, and refuses to disappear no matter how thoroughly we try to scrub it away. And in the summer of 2007, that scent led 2 highly trained dogs to conclusions that would shatter the most publicized missing person narrative in modern history. What Detective Gonçalo Amaral was about to uncover wasn't just evidence. It was a trail of contradictions so profound, so meticulously documented, that it would take nearly 2 decades of legal battles, character assassination, and international pressure to keep it from destroying the story the world had been told to believe. The question isn't whether the evidence existed. The question is why so many people worked so hard to make sure you never heard about it. Late July 2007, nearly 3 months had passed since Madeleine McCann vanished from apartment 5A. The international media circus continued unabated, with daily updates speculating about sightings from Morocco to Malta, from Spain to Sweden. The McCanns appeared regularly on television, their composed faces becoming familiar to millions. The search for their daughter had become a global obsession. But in the Algarve region of Portugal, Detective Amaral's investigation was heading in a direction that had nothing to do with international borders or exotic sightings. British authorities had agreed to send their most elite forensic assets to Portugal, not search and rescue dogs, not tracking dogs trained to follow a living person's scent. These were specialists in death, animals trained to detect what remains when life ends, even when every visible trace has been eliminated. Eddie was a Springer Spaniel with an extraordinary gift. Trained exclusively to detect the scent of human decomposition, he could identify the presence of death weeks, even months after a body had been removed. His nose could detect cadaverine and putrescine, the chemical compounds released during human decomposition, in concentrations so minute that laboratory equipment would struggle to register them. In over 200 cases across Europe, Eddie had never given a false positive, never alerted to something that wasn't there. When Eddie signaled the presence of death, investigators found death. Keeler, his partner, was trained with equal precision to detect human blood, not animal blood, not other bodily fluids, specifically human blood, even in microscopic quantities, even after extensive cleaning attempts with bleach or other chemicals designed to eliminate evidence. Their handler, Martin Grime, had worked with these dogs for years. He understood their signals, their behavior, their reliability. When he brought them to Portugal in late July, he had no agenda, no theory to prove. He simply allowed the dogs to work, to follow their training, to alert if they detected what they'd been trained to find. The deployment began at Apartment 5A on July 31st, 2007. Eddie entered the living room first, his nose working methodically across surfaces, furniture, walls. The apartment had been cleaned multiple times since May 3rd. New guests had stayed there. Cleaning crews had scrubbed every surface. If anything remained from that night, it would be invisible to human senses. But Eddie wasn't human. Behind the sofa, the dog's behavior changed. His body stiffened, his tail went rigid, his nose worked frantically at a specific spot, inhaling deeply, confirming what his training told him was there. Then came the bark, sharp, unmistakable. The signal Martin Grime had heard hundreds of times before. Eddie had detected the scent of human death. The dog moved through the apartment, checking other areas. In the closet of the master bedroom, the same reaction, the same signal, the scent of decomposition, invisible to everyone else in the room, but unmistakable to the animal trained to find it. Then Eddie was presented with items of clothing belonging to Kate McCann. Again, the alert. The scent was there, clinging to fabric, surviving multiple washings. Most significantly, Eddie alerted to Madeleine's stuffed toy, Cuddle Cat, the same toy Kate had clutched in those early photographs. The toy that had become a symbol of a mother's grief had apparently been in contact with human decomposition. The implications were staggering, but the deployment wasn't finished. Keeler, the blood detection dog, was brought in to independently verify Eddie's findings. The Springer Spaniel moved through the same spaces, searching for microscopic traces of human blood. Behind the sofa, alert. In the bedroom, alert. On specific items of clothing, alert. 2 dogs, 2 different specializations, multiple alerts in the same locations, but the most shocking discovery was yet to come. The Maccans had rented a car on May 27th, 24 days after Madeleine disappeared, a Renault Scenic that they'd used for the remainder of their time in Portugal. By late July, the vehicle had been returned to the rental company, cleaned, and prepared for other customers. When Eddie was brought to examine the car, his reaction was immediate and unmistakable. In the trunk, the Cadaver dog gave his strongest alert of the entire deployment. The scent of human decomposition was present in a vehicle the Maccans hadn't even rented until more than 3 weeks after their daughter vanished. How does the scent of death appear in a car rented 24 days after a child disappears? How does it get there if the child was abducted by a stranger on May 3rd? What possible innocent explanation exists for cadaver scent in a vehicle the family obtained weeks later? Keeler independently alerted to traces of blood in the same location, microscopic amounts, invisible without specialized equipment, but present nonetheless. Forensic teams immediately collected samples from every location where the dogs had alerted. Swabs were taken, materials were carefully packaged, everything was sent to the Forensic Science Service in Birmingham, England, for DNA analysis. The wait for results felt interminable. If the DNA matched Madeleine, if it confirmed what the dogs suggested, the entire case would transform overnight. The abduction narrative would collapse. The international sympathy would curdle into something else entirely. The preliminary results came back with tantalizing but frustrating information. The samples contained biological material. The DNA profile showed 15 out of 19 markers consistent with Madeleine's genetic profile. Not a complete match, but a strong partial match that suggested the material could have come from her. But the final report hedged. The samples were degraded, the forensic scientists claimed, too contaminated for conclusive identification. The results were suggestive but not definitive, not enough for criminal charges. This conclusion would later be questioned by independent forensic experts, who noted that even partial DNA matches of this strength warranted further investigation, especially given the context of the dog's alerts. But at the time, the ambiguous results provided just enough uncertainty for the McCann's defenders to dismiss the findings entirely. The dogs were unreliable, they claimed. Kate's medical work with deceased patients could explain the cadaver scent on her clothing, they suggested. The DNA could have come from anyone, they insisted. But these explanations crumbled under scrutiny. Eddie hadn't alerted to Kate's medical equipment or work clothes. He'd alerted to specific items in the apartment and the rental car. The cadaver scent wasn't generalized contamination from her profession. It was targeted, specific, and corroborated by a second dog detecting blood in the same locations. And no explanation was ever offered for how any of this could appear in a car rented 24 days after Madeleine disappeared. While the forensic findings were being analyzed, Amaral's team continued examining the human evidence, the witness statements, the timeline, the behavior of those involved. The inconsistencies were mounting. Jane Tanner's sighting of a man carrying a child had become a cornerstone of the abduction theory. But when investigators pressed her for details, the story kept shifting. In her first statement, the man was walking in one direction. Later, the direction changed. The description of what the child was wearing evolved. The man's appearance became more detailed with each retelling, as if her memory was improving rather than fading, which contradicted everything known about how human memory actually works. Most troubling was the timing. Tanner claimed she'd walked right past Jerry McCann and another friend, Jeremy Wilkins, while they stood talking in the street. She'd seen the man carrying the child at that exact moment. But neither Jerry nor Wilkins remembered seeing Tanner, despite the narrow street and close proximity. How does someone walk past two people in a confined space without any of them noticing each other? The Smith family sighting was even more problematic for the abduction narrative. Martin Smith, his wife, and their adult children had been walking back to their apartment around 10 o'clock when they encountered a man carrying a child. The man was moving quickly, purposefully, toward the beach. The child appeared to be sleeping or unconscious, wearing light-colored pajamas. Smith described the man as appearing uncomfortable, as if the child's weight was awkward, as if he wasn't accustomed to carrying a child that way. The family thought it odd at the time but didn't report it immediately, assuming it was simply a father carrying his sleeping daughter home. Months later, when Smith saw footage of Jerry McCann descending from an airplane, carrying one of the twins, something clicked. The gait, the posture, the way he held the child. Smith contacted Portuguese police and stated he was 60 to 80% certain the man he'd seen that night was Jerry McCann. This was explosive evidence. A credible witness family placing Jerry near the beach, carrying a child matching Madeleine's description at approximately the time she was discovered missing. But British media gave it minimal coverage. It didn't fit the narrative. It raised questions that were too uncomfortable, too controversial. The timeline itself was fracturing under examination. The Tapas 7 had provided statements about who checked on children when, who was at the table at what time, who saw whom and where. But when cross-referenced, the statements didn't align. Gaps appeared. Contradictions emerged. The neat 30-minute checking rotation they described became muddled and inconsistent when investigators tried to map it precisely. Most damningly, the physical evidence at the apartment contradicted the abduction scenario. No signs of forced entry, no fingerprints from an intruder, no disturbance suggesting a struggle or a child being taken against her will. The twins had continued sleeping soundly throughout the alleged abduction and the subsequent commotion, which raised questions about whether they might have been sedated. When Portuguese authorities suggested testing the twins for sedatives in their system, the McCanns refused. When investigators proposed a reconstruction of the night's events, a standard procedure that could help clarify the timeline and identify inconsistencies, The Tapa 7 declined to participate. These weren't the actions of people desperate for answers. These were the actions of people avoiding scrutiny. On September 6, 2007, Kate and Jerry McCann were formally asked to return to the police station for additional questioning. The status of the investigation had shifted. They were no longer merely witnesses. They were now being questioned as people who might have information they hadn't yet disclosed. Kate's interview on September 7th became legendary for what didn't happen. Her lawyer had prepared a list of 48 questions that Portuguese investigators wanted answered. Basic questions, fundamental questions, questions that any parent of a missing child would typically be desperate to address. Why had she left the apartment door unlocked? Had she sedated the children that night? Why hadn't she searched for Madeleine immediately upon discovering her missing? What had she done with her clothing from that night? Why had she washed Cuddlecat, Madeleine's toy, after her daughter disappeared? 48 questions. Kate McCann refused to answer a single one. Her lawyer cited her right to silence, a legal protection available to suspects but unusual for witnesses claiming to be victims. The refusal was technically within her rights, but the optics were devastating. What parent refuses to answer questions that might help find their missing child? What possible reason exists to remain silent unless the answers might be incriminating? 3 days later, on September 10, 2007, Portuguese authorities took the step that would transform the case entirely. Kate and Jerry McCann were formally declared arguidos official suspects in their daughter's disappearance. This wasn't a decision made lightly. Portuguese law required specific evidence to justify suspect status. The cadaver dog alerts, the DNA findings, the timeline inconsistencies, the refusal to cooperate with basic investigative procedures, the contradictions in witness statements. Collectively, these elements met the legal threshold. The media reaction was immediate and divided along national lines. Portuguese newspapers reported the development as a natural progression of an evidence-based investigation. British tabloids exploded with outrage, portraying the decision as a persecution of grieving parents by incompetent foreign police. The narrative war had begun in earnest. Behind the scenes, something else was happening. Something that wouldn't become fully clear until years later, when diplomatic cables and government communications were revealed. The British government was intervening directly in a foreign criminal investigation. Prime Minister Gordon Brown had personal phone contact with the McCanns. The British ambassador to Portugal was involved in discussions about the investigation's direction. Diplomatic pressure was being applied at the highest levels to influence how Portuguese authorities proceeded. Clarence Mitchell, the McCann's spokesman, would later openly acknowledge this intervention. "I was working closely with the British government at the time," he stated in an interview, and the Portuguese were already beginning to get a bit frustrated about the involvement of the British government. Frustrated was an understatement. Amaral and his team were conducting a criminal investigation based on evidence, and they were facing political pressure from a foreign government to reach conclusions that aligned with a preferred narrative rather than forensic findings. This case has more layers than most people realize. If you're starting to see how the official story doesn't match the evidence, hit that like button. It tells me you're paying attention, that you're willing to question narratives even when they're uncomfortable. The pressure on Amaral was intensifying from multiple directions. British media had begun a coordinated campaign to discredit him personally. Articles described him as overweight, incompetent, an alcoholic. These weren't investigative reports about his professional conduct. They were character assassinations designed to undermine his credibility, playing into British stereotypes about Southern European officials. The timing of these attacks wasn't coincidental. They ramped up precisely as the evidence against the abduction narrative became stronger, as the McCanns were named suspects, as the investigation moved toward conclusions that contradicted everything the public had been told. Then came the moment that would effectively end the investigation as Amaral had been conducting it. On October 2, 2007, exactly 1 day after a British newspaper published an article criticizing Portuguese police and quoting unnamed British officials, Gonçalo Amaral was removed from the case. The official reason given was that he had criticized British police in comments to a Portuguese newspaper. The timing couldn't have been more transparent. Just weeks after naming the McCanns as suspects, just as the investigation was building toward potential charges, the lead detective was suddenly removed. Amaral later described the removal as politically motivated, the result of diplomatic pressure that had nothing to do with his professional conduct and everything to do with where the evidence was leading. With Amaral gone, the investigation lost its driving force. The detective who understood the evidence, who had built the case, who had the experience and determination to follow it to its conclusion, was sidelined. The case drifted. Momentum evaporated. By July 2008, Portuguese authorities archived the case, citing insufficient evidence to proceed with charges. The McCann's arguido status was lifted. Officially, the investigation remained open, but practically, it was over. For most people following the story, this seemed like vindication for the McCanns. The Portuguese police had gotten it wrong. The parents were innocent. The real abductor was still out there somewhere. But Amaral knew differently. He'd seen the evidence. He'd followed where it led. And now, freed from the constraints of his official position, he was about to do something that would trigger a legal battle lasting over a decade. In July 2008, Gonçalo Amaral published a book. Its title was direct and provocative, The Truth of the Lie. In it, he laid out everything: the cadaver dog alerts, the DNA findings, the timeline inconsistencies, the refused questions, the behavioral red flags, the physical evidence that contradicted the abduction narrative. His professional conclusion, based on 27 years of investigative experience and months examining this specific case: Madeleine McCann had died in apartment 5A on May 3, 2007. Her death was likely accidental, possibly the result of a fall while the children were left unattended. Her parents had discovered her body, and rather than report the death, they had concealed it, disposed of her remains, and fabricated the abduction scenario to avoid responsibility. This wasn't speculation. This wasn't a conspiracy theory. This was the methodical conclusion of a veteran detective presenting evidence that pointed away from abduction and toward a scenario involving death and cover-up. The book sold over 180,000 copies in Portugal alone. It was translated into multiple languages, every language except English. British publishers refused to touch it, fearing legal action from the McCanns. The McCann response was swift and aggressive. They filed a lawsuit seeking $1.2 million in damages, claiming the book damaged their reputation and hindered the search for Madeleine. What time is it where you're watching this? Because depending on where you are in the world, you might have heard completely different versions of this story. British audiences were told the McCanns were victims of incompetent Portuguese police. Portuguese audiences saw evidence of a cover-up protected by British political intervention. The same case, the same evidence, completely different narratives. Our community spans time zones and continents, and this case demonstrates why that matters. Truth shouldn't change based on which media market you're in, but in the McCann case, it absolutely did. The legal battle over Amaral's book would consume years and cross multiple courts. But before we get to those courtroom victories and what they revealed about the evidence, we need to understand what was really at stake. This wasn't just about one detective's right to publish his findings. It was about whether evidence could be suppressed by wealth, media manipulation, and political pressure. It was about whether uncomfortable truths could be buried beneath sympathetic narratives. It was about whether the powerful could control reality itself simply by controlling the story. The cadaver dogs had detected death. The DNA suggested Madeleine's presence in locations that contradicted the abduction theory. The timeline was riddled with inconsistencies. The behavior of those involved raised profound questions. But none of that mattered if the narrative could be controlled, if the detective could be silenced, if the evidence could be dismissed as unreliable or irrelevant. Gonçalo Amaral was about to find out whether truth could survive when it collided with one of the most sophisticated public relations campaigns in modern history. Whether evidence could prevail when the entire weight of media sympathy, celebrity support, and government intervention was arrayed against it. The answer would take 15 years and multiple court rulings to fully emerge. But when it did, it would vindicate everything Amaral had been saying since 2007. The question is whether anyone was still listening, or whether the narrative had become so entrenched that evidence no longer mattered. What do you think happens when forensic findings contradict the story everyone wants to believe? Do we follow the evidence, or do we protect the narrative? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this question is at the heart of everything that happened next. And make sure you're subscribed, Because Act 3 is where everything comes together, where the legal battles reach their conclusion, where courts rule on whether Amaral's evidence-based theory was legitimate or defamatory, where we discover whether justice can survive when it becomes inconvenient for the powerful. The truth has a scent, and once you've detected it, it's impossible to ignore, no matter how many people insist you're smelling nothing at all. The equation was simple, brutal, and impossible to ignore. Evidence plus time plus scrutiny equals truth. But what happens when you add one more variable? Power, wealth, media control, political intervention. Does the equation still balance? Or does truth become negotiable? For 15 years, Gonçalo Amaral would discover the answer to that question in courtrooms across Portugal and Europe. His battle wasn't just about a book or his reputation. It was about whether evidence could survive when the entire machinery of narrative control was deployed to crush it. The stakes were never just about one missing child. They were about whether reality itself could be rewritten by those with enough resources to control the story. July 2009. Almost exactly 1 year after Amaral published The Truth of the Lie, the McCanns filed their lawsuit in Lisbon. The claim was comprehensive and calculated. They alleged that Amaral's book caused them severe emotional distress, damaged their reputation internationally, and most significantly, hampered the ongoing search for Madeleine by suggesting she was dead rather than alive and findable. The lawsuit sought $1.2 million in damages. For Amaral, already financially strained after leaving the police force and facing mounting legal costs, this wasn't just a legal challenge. It was an existential threat designed to silence him permanently. The initial ruling seemed to confirm the worst. In September 2009, a Portuguese judge granted an injunction against Amaral. The order was sweeping and devastating. His book was to be pulled from shelves immediately. Existing copies were to be seized from bookstores and warehouses. He was prohibited from discussing his theories publicly, in any format, in any venue. For 12 months, The Truth of the Lie was effectively banned in Portugal. Media outlets worldwide reported this as vindication for the McCanns. The detective who had dared to question them had been silenced by the courts. His theories were baseless. His book was defamatory. Justice had been served. But something interesting happens when you try to suppress evidence-based conclusions in a democratic society with freedom of expression protections. The suppression itself becomes evidence of something worth hiding. October 2010. A higher Portuguese court reviewed the injunction and reached a starkly different conclusion. The temporary ban on Amaral's book violated his constitutional right to freedom of expression. The court noted that his theories were based on the official police investigation, that he had led that investigation professionally, and that his conclusions represented legitimate interpretations of documented evidence. The injunction was overturned. The Truth of the Lie returned to circulation. But the main defamation case continued grinding through the legal system, and the McCanns weren't finished. The central trial stretched across years, consuming resources and attention. Witnesses testified. Experts were called. The evidence was examined and re-examined. The cadaver dog alerts, the DNA findings, the timeline inconsistencies. Everything Amaral had documented was presented in a legal forum where emotion and public relations couldn't override facts. In April 2015, the trial court finally delivered its verdict. Amaral was ordered to pay $500,000 in damages to the McCanns. The sum would have bankrupted him, destroyed him financially, ended any possibility of continuing to present his evidence-based conclusions. Media coverage was immediate and triumphant. The McCanns had been vindicated. The detective who persecuted them had been held accountable. Justice, finally, had prevailed. Except the story wasn't over, not even close. Amaral immediately appealed, and in April 2016, the Portuguese appellate court delivered a ruling that received far less international coverage than the initial verdict. The lower court's decision was completely reversed, not modified, not reduced, completely reversed. Amaral was absolved of paying any damages. The court explicitly recognized that his book was based on the official investigation he had led, that his conclusions represented his professional opinion as the detective who had examined the evidence, that his right to express those conclusions was protected. But the McCanns weren't finished either. They appealed to Portugal's Supreme Court, the highest judicial authority in the country. This would be the definitive ruling, the final word on whether Amaral's evidence-based theory was legitimate or defamatory. January 2017. The Portuguese Supreme Court delivered its verdict in a comprehensive 76-page ruling that deserves far more attention than it received in British media. The court didn't just uphold Amaral's right to publish his theories. It made several crucial determinations that fundamentally challenged the narrative the world had been told for nearly a decade. First, the court explicitly stated that the McCanns had not been cleared of involvement in their daughter's disappearance. The case had been archived due to insufficient evidence to file charges, but archived is not the same as exonerated. The distinction matters. It means the evidence Amaral presented remained valid, remained unrefuted, remained part of the official record. Second, the court affirmed that Amaral's right to professional expression and opinion outweighed the McCanns' reputation concerns. This wasn't a close call. The ruling was decisive. A detective who leads an investigation has the right to present his evidence-based conclusions, even when those conclusions are uncomfortable, controversial, or damaging to the reputations of those involved. Third, and perhaps most significantly, the court noted that the McCanns had voluntarily placed themselves in the public eye. They had actively courted media attention, hired public relations specialists, given countless interviews, and built a global campaign around their daughter's disappearance. Having done so, they had diminished their expectation of privacy and their ability to control the narrative surrounding the case. This was a complete legal vindication of everything Amaral had been saying since 2007. Not a partial victory, not a compromise. A full-throated affirmation by the highest court in Portugal that his evidence-based theory was legitimate, protected, and worthy of public consideration. But the McCanns had one more avenue of appeal: the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, the court of last resort for human rights claims in Europe. The argument they presented was sophisticated. Portugal, they claimed, had failed to protect their rights under the European Convention on Human Rights, specifically their right to privacy and family life. By allowing Amaral to publish his theories, Portuguese courts had permitted a violation of their fundamental human rights. The case sat before the ECHR for 5 years. 5 years of uncertainty. 5 years during which Amaral's vindication remained incomplete, subject to potential reversal by a supranational court. September 2022. 15 years after Madeleine McCann disappeared. 15 years after Amaral began following evidence that contradicted the abduction narrative. The European Court of Human Rights delivered its final ruling. Amaral's freedom of expression was justified. The court determined that his role in the investigation, combined with the fact that his book was based on information already in the public domain through official case files, meant his right to express his professional conclusions outweighed the McCanns' privacy concerns. This was the end of the legal road. Every court that examined the evidence, from Portuguese trial courts to the Supreme Court to the European Court of Human Rights, had ruled in Amaral's favor. Not once, not twice, repeatedly and decisively. These rulings carried implications far beyond one detective's personal vindication. By repeatedly affirming Amaral's right to present his evidence-based theory, the courts were making a broader statement about truth, evidence, and the limits of narrative control. The Portuguese Supreme Court's explicit statement that the McCanns had not been cleared of involvement directly contradicted years of media coverage, claiming they'd been exonerated. The courts were saying, in the clearest possible legal language, that Amaral's theory represented a legitimate interpretation of documented evidence, not proven beyond reasonable doubt, but legitimate, credible, worthy of consideration. For Amaral personally, these victories provided vindication after years of character assassination. British tabloids had portrayed him as incompetent, corrupt, alcoholic. They'd attacked his professionalism, his integrity, his competence. But court after court, examining the actual evidence rather than media narratives, had sided with him. For the McCanns, these rulings represented a significant setback in their efforts to control the narrative surrounding their daughter's disappearance. They'd spent millions on legal fees trying to silence Amaral, and they'd failed, comprehensively. For objective observers, the rulings offered a sobering lesson about the difference between media narratives and legal findings. While British media largely portrayed Amaral as a villain persecuting grieving parents, Portuguese courts repeatedly recognized him as a professional, presenting evidence-based conclusions from an official investigation. The contrast reveals something profound about how the same case can be perceived entirely differently depending on which information you're exposed to and which narratives you're encouraged to believe. But legal vindication doesn't answer the fundamental questions that have haunted this case for nearly 2 decades. What really happened to Madeleine McCann on May 3, 2007? The evidence Amaral documented has never been adequately explained by the abduction narrative. The cadaver dog alerts in apartment 5A and in the rental car remain unexplained. How does the scent of human decomposition appear in locations connected to the McCanns if their daughter was abducted by a stranger? The McCanns' explanation that Kate's medical work with deceased patients could have contaminated her clothing doesn't account for why the dogs alerted to specific items and locations rather than showing generalized alerts. It doesn't explain the rental car, obtained 24 days after Madeleine disappeared. The DNA evidence continues to provoke debate. The Forensic Science Service's conclusion that samples were too degraded for definitive identification has been questioned by independent experts who note that 15 out of 19 matching markers represents a strong partial match, warranting further investigation. The decision not to retest these samples using more advanced techniques available today represents a missed opportunity for clarity. Kate McCann's refusal to answer 48 questions during formal questioning has never been fully explained beyond legal strategy. But legal strategy doesn't address the fundamental oddness of a parent refusing to answer basic questions about the night their child disappeared. The timeline inconsistencies documented by Amaral's team have never been reconciled. The witness statements that shifted and evolved. Jane Tanner's citing that changed details with each retelling. The Smith family's identification of Jerry McCann as possibly being the man they saw carrying a child toward the beach. The physical evidence that contradicted initial claims about forced entry. The gemmied shutters that forensic examination proved were never gemmied at all. All of these elements remain part of the official record, unexplained by the abduction theory that dominated media coverage. In 2020, the case took an unexpected turn when German prosecutors announced they had identified a new suspect. Christian Bruckner, a German national with a history of sexual offenses, was living in Pria-de-Loup at the time of Madeleine's disappearance. Prosecutors stated they believe Madeleine is dead and that Bruckner was responsible. This development was presented in some media as vindication of the abduction theory and refutation of Amaral's conclusions. Finally, the real perpetrator had been identified. The parents were innocent. The detective had been wrong all along. But a closer examination reveals a more complex reality. German prosecutors have not disclosed any physical evidence linking Bruckner to apartment 5A or to Madeleine herself. No forensic evidence, no DNA, no witnesses placing him at the scene. Their case appears to rest largely on circumstantial evidence, his presence in the area, his criminal history, and alleged confessions to associates, evidence that has yet to be tested in court. Interestingly, Gonçalo Amaral himself acknowledged Bruckner in his 2008 book, noting that he was investigated and eliminated as a suspect during the original inquiry. Amaral has publicly expressed skepticism about the new focus on Bruckner, suggesting it represents an attempt to create an official perpetrator rather than a genuine breakthrough based on new evidence. He has challenged German authorities to reveal concrete evidence connecting Bruckner to Madeleine's disappearance. So far, that evidence hasn't been made public. The Bruckner development highlights a crucial distinction, the difference between a plausible suspect and actual evidence. Bruckner's criminal history makes him a plausible suspect in an abduction scenario, but plausibility isn't proof. And his emergence as a suspect doesn't address the forensic findings that led Amaral to his conclusions. The cadaver dog alert still happened. The DNA questions still exist. The timeline inconsistencies remain unresolved. Even if Bruckner was somehow involved, these elements of the case demand explanation. Why does this case continue to captivate attention nearly 2 decades after Madeleine disappeared? Partly because it represents a perfect storm of elements that capture public imagination: photogenic victims, exotic location, mysterious circumstances, international intrigue. But more fundamentally, the case represents something rare and significant: a documented instance where an official narrative, supported by unprecedented media coverage, celebrity endorsements, and political intervention, faces serious challenges from evidence that refuses to disappear. The media's role in shaping public perception cannot be overstated. British newspapers adopted the McCann's perspective almost universally, portraying them as beyond reproach and treating alternative theories as cruel conspiracy theories. This created a stark contrast with Portuguese media, which reported more extensively on the evidence uncovered by investigators. The result was two parallel narratives developing in different countries, one evidence-based, one emotion-driven. The same case, the same facts, completely different stories. This media divergence explains why many British observers remain convinced of the McCann's complete innocence, while Portuguese and international observers tend to view the case with more skepticism. It's a powerful demonstration of how media framing can shape public opinion more effectively than actual evidence. What's the weather like where you are right now? Sunny? Rainy? Cold? Our community spans every climate and continent, and this case played out differently depending on where you were standing. Portuguese audiences saw evidence of diplomatic interference protecting a preferred narrative. British audiences saw grieving parents persecuted by incompetent foreign police. Same evidence, different weather, different story. As we approach 2 decades since Madeleine's disappearance, the case stands as a testament to the power of narrative control in the modern media landscape. Despite court rulings affirming Amaral's right to present his evidence-based theory, despite forensic findings never adequately explained, despite timeline inconsistencies never resolved, the abduction narrative remains dominant in many circles, not because it better explains the evidence, but because it has been more effectively promoted and protected. The truth about what happened to Madeleine McCann may never be known with absolute certainty. The passage of time, the contamination of the crime scene, the archiving of the investigation, all of these factors make definitive answers increasingly unlikely. But what we can know, what the evidence clearly shows, is that the case is far more complex and troubling than the simplified version that dominated headlines. And in that complexity lies both the enduring fascination and the profound frustration of a mystery that continues to defy resolution. Gonçalo Amaral's counter-narrative has withstood extraordinary attempts to silence it. Character assassination, legal challenges costing millions, political pressure from a foreign government, media campaigns portraying him as incompetent and corrupt. Despite all of it, his evidence-based theory remains standing. Not because it's comfortable or convenient, but because it addresses questions the official narrative cannot answer. His legal victories, from the Portuguese Supreme Court to the European Court of Human Rights, represent more than personal vindication. They establish crucial precedents about the right of investigators to present evidence-based conclusions, even when those conclusions challenge powerful narratives and damage the reputations of sympathetic figures. The Portuguese Supreme Court's explicit statement that the McCanns had not been cleared of involvement, merely that the case had been archived due to insufficient evidence, directly contradicts the media portrayal of complete exoneration that dominated British coverage. These court rulings affirm a principle often forgotten in high-profile cases. Evidence, not emotion, should guide our understanding. By repeatedly ruling that Amaral's right to present his professional conclusions outweighed concerns about the McCanns' reputation, the courts recognized the fundamental importance of evidence-based discourse in a functioning democracy. The most enduring lesson from this case is about the power of media to shape reality. The stark contrast between how the case was reported in Britain versus Portugal created parallel universes, two entirely different understandings of the same events, based solely on which information was emphasized or suppressed. This divergence serves as a warning. What we know about high-profile cases is often determined not by the weight of evidence, but by the effectiveness of narrative control. The rush to judgment, the embrace of emotionally satisfying explanations, the dismissal of alternative theories, all of these reflect our natural tendency to accept narratives that align with our preconceptions. It's more comforting to believe in a random predator than to consider the possibility of parental involvement, more satisfying to have a clear villain than to acknowledge the messy complexity of real tragedies. But comfort and satisfaction are not the same as truth. Truth resides in evidence, in forensic findings, in timeline inconsistencies. In the questions that remain unanswered, despite years of investigation and millions spent on private detectives and public relations campaigns, the Cadaver dogs detected something in apartment 5A and in that rental car. Whether you believe their alerts or dismiss them as unreliable, they remain part of the documented evidence. The DNA showed 15 out of 19 markers consistent with Madeleine's profile. Whether you consider that significant or inconclusive, it's part of the record. The timeline contains contradictions that have never been resolved. The physical evidence contradicted initial claims about forced entry. These facts don't disappear because they're inconvenient or because they challenge a narrative we've been encouraged to believe. Whatever ultimately happened to Madeleine McCann on that May evening in 2007, her legacy should include this vital lesson. In our search for truth, we must follow evidence wherever it leads, even when the destination challenges our assumptions and comforts, even when powerful forces align to protect a preferred narrative, even when following the evidence costs us sympathy, popularity, or peace of mind. Only then can we hope to honor the victims of tragedy with the one thing they truly deserve: an honest reckoning with the facts. The equation we started with was simple: evidence plus time plus scrutiny equals truth. But we added variables: power, wealth, media control, political intervention. For 15 years, the courts tested that equation, and their answer was clear: evidence survives, truth endures. Not easily, not quickly, not without cost, but it endures. The question now is what you do with that truth. Do you accept it, even though it's uncomfortable? Do you follow where the evidence leads, even though the destination isn't what you expected? Or do you retreat to the comfort of the narrative you've been sold, the story that asks nothing of you except sympathy? Here's what I need you to do right now, not later, right now. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because this is what we do here. We examine cases where the official narrative doesn't align with the evidence, where comfortable stories hide uncomfortable truths, where following the evidence requires courage. Drop a comment telling me what you think really happened to Madeleine McCann. Not what you want to believe, not what the media told you to think. What does the evidence suggest to you? I read every comment, and this community thrives on honest, evidence-based discussion, even when we disagree. Share this video, not because it's entertaining, but because it's important. Millions of people still believe a version of this story that courts have repeatedly determined is incomplete at best. They deserve to know what the evidence actually shows, what the dogs detected, what the DNA suggested, what the timeline reveals. And finally, go watch the other cases on this channel where we've uncovered similar patterns, where media narratives collapsed under scrutiny, where evidence told a different story than the one we were sold. Because the McCann case isn't unique. It's just the most visible example of something that happens more often than we'd like to admit. The truth has a scent. Once you've detected it, you can't unsmell it. You can't pretend it's not there. You can only decide whether you have the courage to acknowledge what your senses are telling you, even when everyone around you insists you're smelling nothing at all. Gonçalo Amaral had that courage. The courts recognized it. The evidence supports it. The question is whether you do too.